I'm going to tell you about John Wesley. John Wesley, the father of the Methodist Church, as you must know. John Wesley was one of the most influential men in 18th century England. He was born in 1704 and he died in 1791. He lived into his 89th year, which is really amazing for a man in the 18th century. But I thought I'd tell you the story in a little different way. I decided I would begin by saying to you, once upon a time, there was a little boy, 5 years old. He had 14 or 15 siblings. His father was a clergyman. His mother was a very wise woman. They lived in an old house with a thatch roof and in a small village in London, in England. And the house caught fire. The mother and father made their way out of the house and led the children one by one out of the burning home until they counted heads and they had all the children gathered together but one. It was the 5-year-old boy. They were frantic. The little boy's name was John, and he had been sleeping in the attic. They slept actually all over the house, and there was no way for John to get out of the building. It was fully aflame. And one man stood toward the house and another stood on his shoulders, and that gave him the height to reach up and save John and lift him down to safety. That 5-year-old boy's name was John Wesley. His mother, who was a prophetic kind of woman, she really was brilliant and quite sensitive religious-wise. And she told John that God had saved him for some special purpose. And John never forgot that. His mother homeschooled the children. She was so bright. She taught them very well until they were 11, at which time each would go off, all the boys anyway, would go off to a school, usually one of the sub-schools at Oxford. Her teaching methods were beautiful. Among the groups that she would teach at a time, 1 hour each week she would spend with each child individually. And that 1 hour each week, she would talk to that child about his or her spiritual welfare. It just seems to me to be an amazing teaching method. And she did that until John was 11 and left for school. Thursday night after supper was John's hour, and he remembered that all his life. It influenced him immensely. He was also influenced by that statement that his mother made, that God had saved him for some great purpose. John went to boarding school in London at 11, can you imagine? And stayed all the way through Oxford in that educational environment. He was a very good student. You can visit the room now at Oxford where he lived part of that time. But John had a problem. He could not get his spiritual life in order. Now, his father was the priest in this village church. It's called St. Andrew's, still is. It's a wonderful place to visit when you're in Epworth in England. And the house that was built after the one burned down is still there too. And John had gone to church all his life, and he knew what it took to be a religious person. And yet he could not find whatever was missing in his spiritual makeup. After he graduated from Oxford and actually was ordained a priest in the Church of England, his oldest brother Samuel, as well as his father, was a priest, and his younger brother Charles became a priest. But at this time, Charles was a student in Oxford, and John found out about a kind of secret meeting that Charles and some other serious students were having. And they would arise at 5 o'clock or so in the morning, and they would read scripture together. They would pray together. They would confess their wrongs together if they had done anything wrong yesterday or the day before or the week before. They confessed those things. Well, you can imagine how that little group went over on campus. They called them Bible moths and religious freaks, and they called them Methodists as an insult because they were so methodical. They were so organized. I mean, it was every day, 5 to 5:30 to 6:15 to 7 o'clock every day. And John didn't like that word Methodist. The others obviously did. And they began to call themselves a Methodist society. In spite of all of that rigorous religious observance, John still was not happy with his spiritual life. He decided that if he could do things, if he could work hard, if he would show how diligent he was for spiritual growth and spiritual satisfaction, maybe that would. Well, how would he do that? Well, the most uninviting thing he could think of was coming to America to be a missionary to the Indians. Now that's what he decided he would do to show how spiritual he was and how religious he was, and maybe that would be the key to his discovering his own spiritual life. Well, he came to America with General Oglethorpe, who had been appointed by the king to be the governor of the colony of Georgia. And Charles went as well. His younger brother went. When they arrived in Georgia, Charles was assigned to a church. It was on one of the islands just off the coast. You can still visit that little church as well too. And sort of the mayor of Savannah had run off for some reason or other. So John was appointed mayor of Savannah, and he did his work with the Indians. The Indians found Mr. Wesley very boring and could not at all understand what he was talking about. And after a stay, well, let me tell you one private thing about Mr. Wesley. I don't need to tell you all of it, but I'll tell you enough He fell in love. He fell in love with a sweet young thing named Sophie Hopke. And Sophie was about 10 years his junior, but Mr. Wesley still was rather fascinated with her. And her uncle was the constable, was the law enforcement person in Savannah. And Sophie got tired of Mr. Wesley's courtship and never popping the question, and so she married someone else. Well, the next Sunday, here came Sophie and her new husband and her uncle, the constable. And Mr. Wesley refused to serve them communion. Now that was a very serious offense because those elements were necessary for salvation. And it was as if Mr. Wesley was turning down salvation to those people. Well, he just decided he would go home. He kept a journal, volumes, many of which can still be read. He kept this journal, and he wrote in his journal that he had gone to America to save the Indians, but was not sure he himself had been saved. Now that's how distressed he was about his religious life. The one good thing that happened to him on this trip to America was he had met some German Christians who seemed to be very quiet and confident in their faith. They were Moravians. And when he got back home to England, he walked to Germany to find them and spend time with them. When they were on board the ship, a storm came, and Mr. Wesley was frightened for his life. But he found the Moravians on the upper deck, embracing, singing hymns, praying to God. Now Wesley thought, wow, that's the kind of faith I would like to have, but I don't have it, and I don't know why. Well, he spent time with the Moravians, and they were extremely helpful to them. Their quiet religious faith, their confidence in God's care for them, the assurance they felt that they had been saved by Christ. Wow, that was the kind of faith Wesley wanted, but it just wasn't happening for him. Not long after he had arrived back home, he went to an early service at St. Paul's in London, a church where you can still worship. And the hymn they sang was a psalm, the psalm that reads, "Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord." Well, that struck Mr. Wesley. He thought that is the expression he himself would use if he wanted to tell somebody how that day had begun for him. Well, the day wore on for him. It was May 25, as I recall, 1738. Mr. Wesley would have been about 35. He says in his journal that evening he went unwillingly to a meeting on Aldersgate Street, a society of religious people, sort of like a prayer meeting for us. And he writes in his journal, while one was reading Martin Luther's description of the change that God can make in the human heart, and describing the assurance that one could feel about God's love for him. He wrote, "I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, and Christ alone for salvation. And an assurance was given me that he had saved me," and he underlined it, "me, from the law of sin and death." The Aldersgate experience was a great event in Mr. Wesley's life. Here he is in his mid-30s. He's finally beginning at least to discover that salvation doesn't take work. It takes an acceptance of God's love. Basically, to say yes to this grace of God that's been hovering around his life, all his life. And on that evening, hearing Martin Luther describe a passage from St. Paul's letter to the church in Rome and describing the change that God can make in one's life, wow, he had an experience. He began to sense that for himself. There were other experiences not unlike that Mr. Wesley would have later in his life. But that Aldersgate experience was the first. Well, now he has great confidence in his faith. He has a feeling of God's love for him. He has a feeling that God has given him the power to preach with a new sense of conviction and a new sense of appeal to people. And the Bishop of London would allow him to preach in churches here and there, but the people began to resent Mr. Wesley's enthusiasm. The church people began to resent his confidence in God's love. Now, one of Mr. Wesley's problems early on and through this time was the church. The church was not the church in Mr. Wesley's thoughts. The church didn't care that there were children working in the mines 12 hours a day. The church seemed not to care that there were young mothers having to work in factories 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The church never preached about it. It never seemed to care. Mr. Wesley did care, and he cared for children. And later, actually, along with a man named Robert Rakes, began what was called Sunday school. It wasn't Sunday school like we enjoy here. It was a Sunday. It was the only day the children didn't go to the mines and didn't go to the factories. And they started teaching them on the streets of London. And those Sunday schools taught children to think and taught them the basics of grammar and arithmetic. He cared very much. He cared very much for the poor people. The church didn't care much for the poor people. It cared for the... Well, let me tell you, I had an old friend who used to say the church cared for hatching, matching, and dispatching. They cared to baptize babies, and they cared to marry people, and they cared to bury people. Hatching, matching, and dispatching. That's all they cared about. They didn't care about young families. They didn't care about young mothers who had to work in the factories or the children who went to the mines every day, 6 days a week. Well, Well, finally, Mr. Wesley was unpopular enough with the people in the churches because, he was preaching about these things. The bishop finally told him he could not preach in any of his churches anymore. Now that was London and beyond. He didn't know what to do with himself. He was a very formal minister. The worship services that his father had conducted when he was a child were very formal services. The services he attended at Oxford, in the big churches in the city, the church in the fields, all those churches were very formal. That's the only kind of worship Wesley knew. But he found out about another kind. There was a fellow friend in that first Methodist society in Oxford who was an evangelist, and he preached like an evangelist. And he was so excited about the gospel. He had an aldersgate kind of experience a long time ago. And he made 8 trips across the Atlantic. He'd come and preach in Philadelphia and preach in Boston and go back and preach in London and preach in Bristol and all around. And Mr. Wesley asked Whitefield how he did this. How do you preach without a church? And Whitefield said, man, it's easy. But I've got a preaching place down there by Bristol. And that's where you ought to go to break in and learn about this kind of preaching. Well, it turned out one of Whitefield's places that he loved to preach was outside a quarry down at Bristol. And he said, there's a mound down there. And when those miners get off from work, I stand on that mound. And he said, I preach to them. And I tell them about God's love. And I tell them Christ had died for them, miners. He said, it's the first time they ever heard that. But that's what I tell them. Well, Mr. Wesley thought, how could anybody preach to a bunch of miners on a mound of coal toward the end of the day? And Whitefield said, I'm going back to America. You show up down there Monday and see what kind of experience you have. Well, Wesley went. And it was indeed the first time those miners were told, except for Whitefield, that God loved them. It was the first time they had heard that Christ had died for them. And he talks in his journal about seeing tears streaking the faces of those miners, 12 hours in the mines, in the quarries there, and how impressed he was, that they were impressed, that they believed what he was saying to them. Well, in the books that about Mr. Wesley, all the writers agree that this was the beginning of the new John Wesley. He found out that you could preach anywhere. He found out that a lot of people had not heard about God's love. He found out that a lot of people in his own country had not heard that Christ had died for them. And he began to preach. This was the beginning of Wesley's discovery that the gospel can be preached anywhere to anybody, and that everybody will be happy to hear it. Wesley not only had a great gift for preaching, he had a gift for organizing. And he as he began to preach all over London, in pubs, in homes, on street corners, wherever he could, wherever there was a crowd. And sometimes he was not welcome. Sometimes they threw things at him. But he wouldn't be discouraged. He moved out of London, and he preached in the villages, and he preached in the cities. And everywhere he would preach, there would be converts. There would be people discovering that Christ had died for them and that they wanted to be a part of a community of people who believed that. So he began to organize these people, and he called them Methodist societies. He didn't begin to organize a new denomination. He didn't set out, as we say, to organize churches. There were plenty of churches, just there was no preaching going on. There was no faith alive in those churches. And he began to organize Methodist societies all over England, Scotland, and Wales. I'm going to tell you something you won't believe. He rode horseback 250,000 miles. Is that amazing? You can follow in his journey, in his journal, every place he went, every sermon he preached, every person he talked to, the leaders. He preached 44,000 sermons. He wrote 440 books and tracts and leadership guides. He didn't leave those Methodist societies leaderless. He would select a person in each one to be the leader. And then he would, if there were enough people there, he would divide the societies into classes. And there would be a leader for every class. And they would meet, cost you a penny to come, but they would meet every day but Sunday, and they would teach, and they would learn. They would teach what Mr. Wesley taught them. They would read what Mr. Wesley had written for them. And these Methodist societies began to be very well informed. Wesley was concerned about everything. He was concerned that alcoholism was rampant among the poor people. Wesley was very concerned about it. Slavery was happening in Great Britain as well as in the colonies. Mr. Wesley's, from the bottom of his soul, thought that was dead wrong, and he preached against that. He preached in favor of caring about children. He opened schools himself where children could come and learn. And he was against slave labor. He was against child labor. He was against women's laboring in places that were unsanitary and not safe. He preached against everything that was evil. He did not allow the societies to build churches. He said that's a waste of money. You can meet in people's homes. He finally allowed them to build a building, a church, that is today called Wesley's Chapel. It's out on City Road Street in London. You need to go there when you're in London. And the only home that Wesley ever owned is beside the church, and it's kind of a one-room, it looks like a Lego building. But that was the only home he ever owned. And he finally got to the place where he could not ride horses, about 80 or 85 or something. And so he would hire buggies to carry him from place to place. But until he died, he was on the move, visiting and revisiting the Methodist societies all over England, Scotland, and Wales. And they were all over the place. They were in every village. There were several of them in cities like London. Some of the Methodists in those societies felt they would have a greater opportunity for a good life in America. And so many of them came to the colonies. But they didn't have any leaders, and so they appealed to Mr. Wesley to send them some leaders also. And so he sent them some leaders. Now these leaders were not ordained. They were trained. They were trained by Mr. Wesley. They were trained to teach. They were trained to preach. They were trained to pray. They were trained to teach other people to be trained. And Wesley kept a pretty close hand on them. One of the leaders he sent was just a young man. I think he was 18. His name was Francis Asbury. And Asbury sort of became the leader of the Methodists. He just had that kind of spirit and those kind of gifts. And he would be up and down the coast. And then the war broke out. And the colonists decided they didn't want to be a part of England anymore. And the Methodists decided they didn't want to be a part of Mr. Wesley anymore. And so Mr. Wesley called them all home, called all the leaders home. And all of them went home except one, Francis Asbury. Well, the colonists didn't trust Asbury because he was under control of Mr. Wesley. And so they told him he could not leave the state of Maryland. He could not leave Maryland. Well, he did. He was up and down the coast. He was in all the little Methodist societies and organizing new ones. He crossed and recrossed the Allegheny Mountains on horseback 80 times. He rode nearly as far on horseback as Mr. Wesley did, and that was in rugged country, in uncharted country. Well, in 1784, the Methodists in America wanted to be a church. They wanted to have their leaders ordained. They wanted to have their leaders so the children could be baptized and the adults could be baptized. They wanted their leaders to be able to marry people and bury people when they lost them. And so Mr. Wesley drew up some papers for them that would give them guidance in organizing themselves into a denomination. He sent them orders of worship. He sent them things that they needed to believe. He sent them a hymn book, but he finally separated himself from them. It wasn't easy for him. He was kind of a control freak, but he finally separated himself from them. In 1784, they decided, the Methodists in America decided to have a Christmas conference. Most of the leaders weren't married. They were being sent here and there, and most of the preachers weren't married. Life was too hard, and they were too busy, and so one of the preachers who was a good horseman rode up and down the 13 colonies and invited everybody to come to a little church called Lovely Lane Chapel in Baltimore, 1784. The chapel, the people who were members of that society were so proud that all those Methodists were coming to their church, to their little chapel. They put backs on the pews. Yeah. And since it was going to be at Christmas, in Baltimore, they decided they better put a stove inside it. Hadn't had one before. And they even built a balcony so that visitors could come. Now, Mr. Wesley fell for this plan, and he sent a man named Thomas Coke, who was an ordained clergyman. I honestly think Wesley ordained him himself, though he didn't have the authority to. And he sent one ordained guy from another denomination, and they were to be in charge of the meeting in Baltimore, and they were given the right to organize the Methodist societies of America into a denomination. And they called themselves the Methodist Episcopal Church. I don't know why they added Episcopal in there, because that's the only church they knew, I guess. And Methodist ministers have wanted this kind of elevation for themselves ever since. But Francis Asbury was ordained a deacon one day, an elder the next day, and a bishop the next day. Now, ever since that time, Methodist preachers have wanted that kind of elevation for themselves. None has ever had it. Mr. Wesley didn't want him to call himself a bishop. He wanted to call himself the General Superintendent for Methodist Work in America. And Wesley said, I'll call myself the General Superintendent for Methodist Work in England, in Great Britain. Well, Asbury thought that was a little awkward, so he started calling himself a bishop. And Wesley wrote him and said, you can call me a snake in the grass, you can call me any dirty word you can think of, but do not call me a bishop. And so they didn't. Well, that's how we got started. There were certain members of that gathering in 1784 who had shown more promise than others, and so Mr. Asbury and Mr. Coke, whom Wesley had sent over, somebody asked Wesley how he had the authority to ordain Thomas Coke and send him to America. And he said, I assumed the authority. He said, nobody had the authority to ordain the Apostle Paul, nor Simon Peter. So he said, I just ordained him myself. And Coke and Asbury became the first two bishops of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Those bishops and those general superintendents, they called them, had the authority to send any Methodist preacher anywhere. That's why Methodism spread so fast in the early. There were more Methodist churches in Indiana and Tennessee and Kentucky and Illinois and Ohio than all the other denominations put together. It was not pleasant to go to Ohio, when most of the population were Native Americans. But the Methodist bishops had the authority to send their preachers there. And so there they went. You would know that during the Civil War, the Methodist Episcopal Church split into the Methodist Episcopal Church South. In fact, let me see. In fact, I think I joined the Methodist Episcopal Church South. I found my baptismal certificate the other day, and I think I did. My grandmother said she would always be a member of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And she died as such. In 1939, the Methodists decided they could live together, North and South. And so there was a great uniting conference. And by the way, along the way, there were some Methodists who thought bishops had too much power, and they didn't like having bishops over them. And so they separated themselves into the Methodist Protestant Church. So in 1939, the Methodist Protestant Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South and the Methodist Episcopal Church had a great uniting conference in Kansas City, and we became the Methodist Church. Now, in 1968, there were some smaller churches that had been born in this revival that John Wesley had sweeping across England, Scotland, and Wales. They did not join the movement by name, but they called themselves the Brethren Church. One of them called themselves the United Church. And they wanted to be a part of our larger denomination. So in 1968, we became the United Methodist Church. We took one of the words from their title and one of the words from ours. And that's how we got to be what you are now. Well, let's see, we've got 2.5 minutes for you to ask any question. We got more than that. Yeah, any question.
So you mentioned they had to bring a penny.
Yeah, they had to pay a penny. They had to pay a penny, and that's a good question. Wesley did not want to exclude anybody, but he thought anybody could bring a penny. Well, there were a lot of pennies being brought, and Mr. Wesley collected them and gave them away to the poor, to children. When Mr. Wesley died in 1791, he's buried, by the way, out behind Wesley's Chapel, out on City Road Street in London. When he died, they found enough money to hire 6 homeless men to carry his casket from the church to its burial place around behind. I asked my Wesley professor at the School of Theology, I said, what was Wesley proud of? What did he own that he was proud of? He said 2 things, his wig and the silver buckles on his shoes. He really did raise a lot of money. He sold the books, he collected the pennies, but he gave everything away. He died a pauper. He died with nothing, enough to pay 6 homeless men to carry his casket. He gave it all away. He found out when he was a student that he could survive on a lunch of 29 cents. He ate a 29-cent lunch for the rest of his life. He knew he could survive on that, and there wasn't any use in spending more, so that's what he spent. He was very frugal. He was bold. He was smart. He wrote a book on. He called it Primitive Physiques, and it's a health book. And it's about this thick. And it tells you what to eat, tells you what not to eat. It has a lot of old wives. What do you call those? Old wives healing processes like your great grandmother used. He has a lot of those in there, and he knew, or he thought, that a slight shock can be good for you, and so he built a shocking machine that you put your hand on, and then you turn this handle, and it'll shock you. I did it. It's still up there in his apartment, and some of his clothes are up there. His feet were about this big. He stood about this tall. He was about 5'3" or 4". Never weighed more than 125 pounds. Isn't that an amazing story? This man was unbelievable. He was unbelievable.
What was the name of the book again?
It's called Primitive, and then a PHYSQUE book, of physique in Old English. But it was primitive.
Did he have children?
No children. That's an interesting question. So you heard about Sophie. Well, I think that turned him off women forever. But there was a widow who was interested in him and followed him about, and finally persuaded him to marry her. And the next morning, he was on his horse, and he said, "You're not going?" And she said, "Going where?" He said, "I have 3 preaching appointments today." She said, "I think not." And she stayed home. That was the end of that.
We couldn't have done all that marvelous work. Rode
Oh, no.
50,000 miles.
No, she couldn't have ridden that far. I mean, who would want to? He was just determined. He was determined. He was driven.
He went to school at Oxford from the age of 11 to, I think it's 20.
Oh gosh, till 22 or so. Yeah.
So his
Yeah.
education was vast.
He was well educated for the time. Most people didn't go to school at all. Most children didn't.
Did his father influence the situation?
His father was not a very effective influencer, and he wasn't a very effective minister. The people in the village didn't like him, and his mother was the teacher in the family. And one time he had to go to prison for debtors. Went to debtors' prison. Couldn't pay his bills. They hadn't paid him his salary, and the government paid part of their salaries. They were actually employees of the state, and he went to jail. And while he was in jail, his wife Susanna preached in the kitchen, and he didn't like that a bit, because she was a better preacher than he was. And
Well, what I want to know is, how did he afford to go to Oxford? I mean, how did that come
well, his father, the church was owned by the government. It was the Church of England, and his father was paid by the state. And as long as they were getting money from the state, he probably got tuition. And by the way, and I don't know what this means, but I'm going to find out. When he was a very young adult, he was named a fellow of Oxford, which gave him a slight salary all his life. Does anybody know what that means? I'll tell you what, I'm going to find out, and I'll come back and tell you. But that was a high honor. His father had a position, as it were, in spite of the fact he might not have.
He was a constable? What did you say?
No. That was Sophie Hopkins' uncle. Yeah. No kin.
Did anything happen to Charles, his brother?
Oh, that is a very good question. Do we have time?
Yeah.
Let me tell you what Charles did. Charles wrote 6,800 hymns. Isn't that amazing?
What's the most popular one? I mean, as far as
Oh, I'll tell you what. Look in the hymnal. In the back section, it lists the authors, and it'll list. John wrote some hymns too. It will list Wesley, Charles, and then there will be 10 or 12 or 15 hymns in our current hymnal that Charles wrote. You can find that though. 6,800. He had a wife. He had a normal life. He had a wife and several children. Huh? No, he came, but he got sick of it before John did, and he went home. Georgia wasn't a pleasant place. He he lived in, where did I tell you where that my first mine was? Bristol. He lived in Bristol. And you can visit his house there. And you can visit a church in Bristol. And there's a big grandfather clock in the church that John Wesley presented to the congregation.
Well, did his influence about the kids and slaves and all that, was that a part of John Wesley?
He worked with the prime minister until slavery was ousted in Great Britain. Yeah, you can imagine this guy. He's known everywhere. Everybody knows John Wesley, and he had great influence. He had great influence. He had influence over the legislature. He had influence over the prime minister, and he was a regular advisor to the prime minister on issues like slavery and alcoholism and child labor. Yeah. Yeah. He had great influence. I'm going to make you late to church.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much.